Hello everybody, my name is Dratnos, and in today's video we're going to take a look at the War Within Season 1 Dungeon Rotation, which has been data mined by Wowhead, so this has not been officially announced by Blizzard, but historically these have been accurate when they've been data mined by Wowhead. There have been some fake, leaked seasons that haven't come to pass, but all the ones that have been data mined in this context so far have been accurate. And so here are those dungeons. We have Arakawa, City of Echoes, City of Threads, the Stone Vault, and the Dawnbreaker, which are War Within dungeons. And notably, neither of the two dungeons that are testable on PTR that you can check out, or on the alpha, the current build, the alpha at least, which you can check out on my channel already. I have some run-throughs of those two. But there are also 4 returning dungeons here. Mist of Tierna Scythe and Necrotic Wake from Shadowlands, Siege of Borealis from BFA, and Grim Batol from Cataclysm. So let's talk a little bit about what these dungeons do. I'm not going to talk at all about the 4 War Within dungeons because we don't know anything about them. But I will talk about these dungeons, what I think they need to change about them as they refurbish them, bring them back in to the season here, and then my overall takes on it. So I will say initially my reaction on seeing these 4 be the chosen returning dungeons was pretty negative. I'm not a huge fan of Necrotic Wake or Siege of Borealis, and then Mist I'm reasonably high on, and Grim Batol is such an old dungeon that it's kind of out of the scope of things that I have an opinion about, really. I didn't play much Cataclysm, and I definitely didn't play at a super high end in that expansion, so Mist of Tierna Scythe up first. This dungeon I was a pretty big fan of back in the day. Let's see, let's tab in. And this dungeon had a pretty good, I think, reception in Shadowlands as well. It was reasonably easy. It was a short timer as well. It is, you had a little bit at the start where you would do it would involve skipping quite a bit of this stuff at the start. Now, there was a Covenant ability in every Shadowlands dungeon except for Tazavesh, and in Mist, it was if you had a Night Fae, you would get access to a graveyard and some mushrooms here and like here. You could get graveyard updates, and you get some mushroom buffs in this little side area. You get mushroom buffs from the side area, and then you get a graveyard update after the first boss. Only if you had a Night Fae interact with little root thing, little seed thing. I think there was maybe one after the second boss as well. I don't actually remember for sure on that. The bosses in this dungeon were pretty good. The first boss was actually really tough on Tyrannical. I would say Ingram Malik was one of the bosses that most early in the key progression would become very hard on Tyran. So hopefully this is something that they toned down a little bit, because this is something where even like a weekly 15 at the time, this dungeon would be like, oh, if we're doing this thing on Tyran, if we, like, the hard part is going to be Ingram Malik, and it's actually going to be really hard for us, even at this, lower key level than, say, the super high key pushers are doing. And then if you were a super high key pusher, the dungeon was just all about, can you defeat Ingram Malik or not? Then you had the maze area. The maze area was, I'm a little surprised they brought this dungeon back, because the maze area was, like, I feel like it was something they were probably glad to be rid of, trying to bug fix and fiddle with. It had, so that you would have these different pedestals in front of all of the different doors, and you had to identify which one was the correct one to go through based on which one didn't fit the pattern of the other pictures, which, depending on which one, there were different routes you could get through here, and only some were valid, right? Like, if you went here, you could either go here or here, and then if you went here, it was just always this one, but if you went here, you could go, like, here. I think you actually would go here, 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 or, like, I don't remember either, but basically you were always guaranteed to get, like, a roughly similar amount of count and a roughly similar amount of rooms, no matter which path you ended up proccing in this, and some of the packs were a little bit more difficult than the others. Wasn't a big deal, though. And then this boss, Mistcaller, pretty fun boss. Had the disorient your tank if they don't kick thing, which was always funny, and killed people. And then it had an ad phase that was pretty nasty if you didn't have a lot of damage. to get the right mist color. You had to play the same game as well as the maze. And then there was like a big old trash pull you could do here, or you could split this up. This area was actually pretty difficult in less coordinated groups as well. And then you get to Tredova, which was a boss that was heavily nerfed from the very earliest versions of it that were fought, especially on PTR. It was one of the most hard bosses ever. But it had this mechanic where it would shoot acid at you. And the first time it shot the acid, you could just dodge it. And then the second time, one acid projectile would be like aimed at the direction you dodged the last time. So like if I started here and then I dodged over here, then next time it spawns on me, one acid is going to land on me, right? And one is also going to go over here towards where I dodged last time, so I have to dodge in a different direction. It was a pretty interesting little mechanic, and overall I think a good boss, good dungeon, nice little 3-boss dungeon, pretty quick adventure. I quite like this dungeon. I think all it requires to come back is a little bit of reduced, probably scaling on Ingram Malik. Something like every time you complete a tree phase, maybe doing some bonus damage to the boss HP or something like that. Could be a really good way to make it so that it scales better into hierarchies on Tyran. Then we have Necrotic Wake. So Necrotic Wake was another Shadowlands dungeon. This dungeon I was not a fan of, but I don't think it's insurmountable for this dungeon to be quite good. This dungeon had 2 major problems, and I think they're both pretty solvable ones. The first was that Zul'Ramis gatekeepers are extremely unrealistic mobs to ever fight. These guys were just so much more difficult than anything else in the area, and so you had to maneuver your pulling in the first area of this dungeon, where you would do something like, yeah, we're gonna fight all of this at once, and we'll fight this like back over here or whatever. If fortified, we'll do it with lust, and then we'll like sneak around to here, and we'll do the boss with some trash or whatever on the next pull, or maybe we'd even do like this pull and then we do boss or something like that. We do like this, and then we would like sneak up and around the side so that we wouldn't pull this gatekeeper. And I thought that was stupid. I think anytime there's mobs where it's like you never want to pull this guy, that's bad. They did a pretty good job of fixing that with the honor guard in Ataldazar, where like, yeah, you still don't pull that honor guard in front of Volkal now, but you can, and it's not a disaster. So that's thing number 1 I'd like to see fixed with Necrotic Wake, is Zul'Ramis gatekeepers becoming a little bit less offensive. The other thing was that you would often do much of your damage in this dungeon with various weapons that were scattered around the place. Not to mention the Kyrian orb, so there were some Goliaths that Kyrians could activate, and then you'd pulse for damage around you, and that was really powerful. But there were also a bunch of weapons, and the meta would kind of be to pick up weapons, and you'd save them, and you'd use them to nuke down certain bosses, or you'd do really, really big pulls, and then you'd use weapons to kill them. And anytime there's a dungeon where a large part of it is based on using some gimmick in the dungeon to do damage rather than doing it yourself, that's something that I'm not often a fan of, because I just find that less fun than, doing a dungeon with my character. And I don't usually like the optimization of like, okay, we're doing this pull, it's like 50 mobs, we've got to find a way to survive for 10 seconds, and then we're going to kill it using this weapon or whatever, right? We're going to do that, and I don't know. I find that to be difficult in like a fiddly, annoying way, but not really satisfying to execute. So that's the other thing I hope they resolve with Necrotic Wake. I hope they change that. Then we have Siege of Borealis, which hails from the expansion of Battle for Azeroth. This dungeon had 2 big problems as well. One was the spotters. So these mobs were Ashvane spotters. They did sighted artillery, and what this would do is it would target like everybody in your group, I think except for the tank, and it would put circles beneath them, and then a couple seconds later a bomb would land on that spot. And that bomb would damage enemies as well. So what you would do is you would get a little bit of trash. You would kind of do the dungeon a little bit like normal. You'd do some skips at the start. You'd do a little bit of that kind of stuff. You'd get here, you'd kill this boss, and then you would sneak ahead. Maybe you'd find a clever little gateway that you could do through the wall here. You'd sneak ahead, you'd shroud on up, and then you would use the spotter to kill these 4 snipers, and you could keep them CC'd until you dropped all the bombs on their heads, and then just have them instantly die to that. And then you would like back pull. You would use the spotter, and you would kill all of these pulls using the spotter, And you would do the same with these mobs. And for a while, you would do it on the tentacles on the last boss. They changed that, so it didn't work. But that worked for a while. And especially on Bullstring Week, back when Bullstring was permanent and increased damage as well as health, you could bolster up a big spotter and just have it one-shot everything in the dungeon. So that was pretty stupid. I hope that's something that they change about how the spotters function. I'm not sure exactly what the way to change that is. Maybe... I mean, just making the spotters not damage enemies is... Obviously, you lose a little bit of, like, flavor there, but I think that was pretty degenerate. It would be nice to go away. The other problem is you'll see up here we have a little checkbox that says Faction, Horde, or Alliance. And you can change this, and it's like, oh, look, nothing's changing. But over here at the start of the dungeon, if you have Horde selected, you have these nice Kultiran halberds. You know, they do Slobber Knocker. Marksman, a little bit annoying. They do some damage to your group. If you change this to Alliance... Some of the most demented creatures that I've ever seen in my life spawn in this area at the start of the dungeon if you're playing Alliance here. The Powder Shots, the Black Tar Bombers, the Dockhounds. These mobs are extremely hard compared to the Horde version, so you would just do a big ol' skip before you started this dungeon as... you would try really hard to not fight these if you were playing Alliance. The first boss behaved a little bit differently, but it was mostly the same between Horde and Alliance. And... The other difference was the gate at the end. After you killed Hadal Darkfathom, this gate would open like 30 seconds faster if you were playing Horde versus if you were playing Alliance. If you were playing Alliance, you had to stand there and wait for some RP before it opened. So, especially in a world of cross-faction, it would be really annoying to just randomly get the wrong Siege of Borealis because the wrong person like zoned into the dungeon first and you accidentally got the Alliance version instead of the Horde version. They should normalize that. They should get rid of any faction differences. And they should make the Horde version the default because that was a better dungeon than the Alliance version, and change the spotters. And I think that goes most of the way towards making Siege a pretty good dungeon. And then finally, we have Grim Batol, a dungeon for which I don't have an MDT. It's not an MDT just yet. That dungeon is too old for me to remember much about. All I know is that there was a big bombing run at the start. You would get on your dragons, and you would do like an actual bombing run over the enemies and blow them up with some buttons that you could press while you were flying over them. And much of the trash in the start and then towards the end of the dungeon would be vulnerable to getting bombed by this bombing run. I believe they've already said they're going to keep that in. I hope they find a way to make it so that doing the bombing run perfectly isn't something you really need to focus on doing and isn't something you need all 5 of your group to be able to do, because I think that would be pretty bad, especially on like pugs. So I hope they find a way to make it so that, you know, if 2 people in your group have a very good idea of what the targets are and 3 people are like kind of know what they're doing on that bombing run, you get almost all the benefit out of it. And as long as that's true, I think it's not the end of the world to have the bombing run in that dungeon. But if it is something where it's like, okay, we've got to have all 5 people, like, we open up MDT and it's like, okay, we're bombing this pack and this pack and this pack and this pack, and we're getting them to like 2% HP so that we can still pull them and tag them and get count from them. Like, if there's anything like that going on, I am tremendously worried about Grim Batol as a dungeon. If they find some good way to make the bombing run happen but not feel like that, then I think the dungeon could be pretty good. These older dungeons, when they brought them back, have been a lot less about how they were in Cataclysm and a lot more about how they have refurbished them. So, Grim Batol, you know, that refurbishing, we have to see what that looks like before we know whether it'll be good or bad. But initially, I'm definitely skeptical of the bombing run. I hope it is something that they find a way to make not awful. And there's definitely a lot of ways they could make it awful. So, those are my thoughts on the dungeon rotation. I hope you are looking for... I guess one final thought. Going into Dragonflight, I was hopeful that Season 1 would contain all 8 Dragonflight dungeons, and then they would start rotating after that. They didn't do that in Dragonflight, and instead Dragonflight, the end of the expansion, is going to have all 8 dungeons. I don't know for sure how I'm going to feel about this after that. Maybe I'll be like, oh yeah, it was really nice to have it at the end of the expansion. But my gut feeling is I would still prefer that. I still kind of wish Season 1 was just like all new content. And then Season 2, it was like, okay, we've rotated out these 4 dungeons. You'll see them later in this expansion. And here's some, you know, BFA and Shadowlands dungeons. And then Season 3, it was like, okay, we're rotating back in those War Within dungeons. And here's some new you know, BFA and Legion dungeons or whatever. Like that, to me, still sounds better than doing it this way. But I don't feel too strong about that, but I do still kind of wish that that was what they did. Anyways, those are my thoughts on the dungeon pool, the dungeon rotation coming in Season 1. Again, remember, it's data mined, so we don't know for surezies that this is what they're doing, but we know for pretty surezies that this is probably at least what they're currently planning for the dungeon rotation to be. Hope you've enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think about these dungeons in the comments down below. Let me know if you have any other, like, oh, I really hope they change this boss in Necrotic Wake or whatever. Put those down below. And yeah, thanks for watching. See you in the next one. Bye.